All right, here we are. Mossflower. Yes, that one's Mossflower. This video is a bit late. And that's because, well, a bunch of things happened. We had Sunday was busy. Then Monday we had like a spring cleaning out the garage thing. Tuesday we had haircuts. Wednesday was just busy. And today was really the first like free day where I had a free evening to record. So now I'm doing the Mossflower video later than I wanted it to be, but should be all good. I am making good progress on Mattimeo. 20 chapters in, most of which was done today. I can easily do another 20 tomorrow. It's only 55 chapters, something like that. Enjoying it immensely, but that'll be next week. Um, this week, Mossflower. Very fun. I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected to. So, let me think. Um, when I first read Mossflower, it was the third book I had read in the Redwall series. I started with Redwall, moved to Mattimeo because that's what we had in the house, and then I got Mossflower from the library because it was the sort of next one available. And I've been sort of working my way, and then from there I just went more or less in order. Um, I remember, I think the first time I read Mossflower, I remembered it being more slow paced, and I remembered it being um, just less fun overall. I didn't enjoy it as much as I enjoyed Mattimeo or Redwall. I enjoyed it a lot more this time, and it surprised me pleasantly in a number of ways. Um, I'll get to those in a little bit. As far as pacing goes, because I kind of want to get that out of the way at the start. For about two thirds, even 4/5 of the book, it's really solid. Like, got that weird little time skip at the start that feels a bit odd and out of place, but not too bad. And then the last little chunk of it feels off in some places, like the timing doesn't quite make sense, but it works out. And there are a few places where it feels like a plot line was sort of forced in to make the very end of the story work, which isn't uncommon in writing, is having the middle sort of lag behind the opening, which is really good, and the ending, which is really good, having the middle. In this case, it's like the sort of fourth fifth of the book is a little rough. The last 10 chapters are great. The first 30 odd chapters are great. And then that sort of 10 chapters in between those is it can be rough. Um, Not bad by any means, but um, I guess my favorite example would be like Bella wandering off into the woods in search of Gingerveer to a, in search of a new base for the Corum. And my yeah, I forgot Gingerveer existed. It's been long enough. I remembered Martin was sort of the focus. I remember there was a badger. I remember the loamhedge mice showed up, and I remembered that there was Noth and there was a mole that joined them, but I didn't remember much else. I remember that there was the battle with the sea rats, and there were the hares, and there was the badger, but I didn't remember any of their names, and I didn't remember any of their personalities. Um, which, could be worse, could be better. Um, I think overall, characterization is done better in Mossflower than it is in Redwall. And I'll get a couple of specific examples, but my favorite one would be the various evil lieutenants that Sarmina has. There are fewer. Sarmina has fewer lieutenants than Clooney did, and they all have more and better characterization. Um, and this time I'm gonna try and keep the video a little shorter because the last one was like an hour of recording cut down to 45 minutes of actual video. So I'm gonna try and go a little shorter. Beginning of the book opens really strong, actually. You of course got the little blurb that Jake's always does, hinting at a later part of the story. It's really only a couple of chapters in, but it's that bit that grabs the reader's attention. We've got beautiful map, and then Mossflower lay deep in the grip of midwinter beneath a sky of leaden gray that showed tinges of scarlet and orange on the horizon. The thing I've got noted on in my notes, written down in my notes, is feels like I'm stepping into a painting. There's actually a couple places throughout Mossflower where it feels like I'm stepping into a painting. With Redwall, with the first book, I never really got that feeling. The descriptions were good, and in a lot of cases they were vibrant, but that feeling of stepping into a painting and being there I didn't get that until the very first line of Mossflower, and that's an opener. That's how you open a book. It paints a beautiful picture. Um, we're the first characters we meet aren't our protagonists. They're the Stickle family and Earthclaw the mole. And while they're somewhat important, they're not vital to the story. They provide the Stickles are part important to the main plot in some ways. They're very important to several subplots. But most importantly, they feel interesting and sympathetic right off the bat. These are simple folk being taxed horribly by a honestly dysfunctional system. Without, I've got noted that Verdoga, the whole village at the base of Katir was only functional when Verdoga was ruling, the old Verdoga, not Sarmina Verdoga. Um, when and with him dying and Sarmina taking over the daily ordering of things, everything is now dysfunctional and doesn't work. Gingervere is a really fun character. Sarmina is a very fun, is like brilliant. Very solid villainous. I think better than Clooney in some ways. Um, and like properly intimidating as well. Um, Knopf is solid. I feel like he doesn't get as much comeuppance as he really should. He starts off very jovial. He doesn't face too many challenges or too many places where that optimistic demeanor is broken. And I'm not usually one for to advocate for the torturing of characters, but I feel like Knopf could have had a little more hardship come his way. Um, Martin's introduction is very solid. He's introduced pretty much from afar, and then we sort of zoom into him, and we get his motivation for disliking Sarmina, etc. Um, him taking up with the Woodlanders feels pretty natural, and the way Jakes does it, he doesn't spend too much time on the winter before Martin joins Corim. Um, and I do like Corim. I also like that the shrews in here aren't Gusum shrews. Um, they're just the shrew tribe. I'll get to Log in a minute. Um, Verdoga and Martin have like one interaction before Verdoga is murdered, and it gives the impression that Verdoga, while an evil creature, is one who has a respect for warrior beasts. And that is something that Martin most definitely is, even if his sword is broken by Sarmina. Um, I get. Let me see. With Knopf coming in, we get to see a lot of Jake's poetic side. Mossflower is where a lot of the poetics start picking up. And that's continued, at least in Mattimeo, as far as I've gotten. But from what I recall throughout the whole series, there are always poems and riddles and ditties in rhyme form being introduced. And Jake seems to take delight in them, and I, of course, take delight in them. While I'm not a massive fan of poetry as a whole, um, I've been exposed to enough truly awful modern poetry that it's hard to be. Um, there is some beauty There's some definite beauty to be gotten from poetry. Um, the puzzles throughout Mossflower are, I think, better than in Redwall. They're solved at a more reasonable pace. They're paced out more. Um, and it's just it's really well done. There are also a whole bunch. This is one of the things I keep noticing throughout is that Mossflower is almost a setup to like a half dozen other books. Sunflash the Mace is mentioned, Lord Brocktree, Luke the Warrior, um, and of course Martin is there, and so Timbalisto. A whole bunch of Martin's friends get named, and so um, I'm not sure if Jake's had them all like completely planned out, but it definitely gives the impression that Jake's had a whole bunch of other ideas in the works at the time, and that, as an author, is very reassuring. As someone who wants to be an author, is very reassuring. It's like, yeah, you can have all those things, and you can sneak in those references even before the books are written. That's very nice. Um, One of the things I like about Sarmina's horde is that it's very different from Clooney's. Clooney's was mostly sea rats with a few um, sort of ferrets and stoats and weasels, but they're local, that have been sort of levied in, conscripted. Whereas Sarmina's force is a professional fighting force, or at least it was under Verdoga, and it is mostly ferret, stoats, and weasels with a command with a fox, a marten, and a bunch of wildcats up at the top. Um, and I think that works out pretty well. As for her lieutenants, Clud is probably the best used general I've seen thus far. Um, Fortunata dies in a very fitting manner. Um, Ashleg is Ashleg's great. I don't think Ashleg gets like a couple lines of dialogue, not a lot, but they're enough to sort of establish his personality. Um, and most of his characterization is actually done through Argalor, the eagle who is trying to eat the marten, Ashleg. And it's so beautiful, and his escape is both a payoff and a setup, because it's a payoff because it's the payoff of Ashleg recognizing that he's been in the service of the Verdogas for years, but really there's no point when Fortunata when Sarmina is going mad. He is increasingly in danger there, and so he sets aside his cloak, puts on a plain one, and leaves. And so when Argalor eventually sees the marten, it's the fox that Sarmina has promoted and given Ashleg's cloak to, because Sarmina's recognized Argalor's taste for marten, or rather for the cloak, and exploits that, even if she thinks that Argalor was um, kidnapped or killed or turned traitor Ashleg, and then she killed a very poor, I think it was a stoat, that was sent to keep an eye on her, thinking it to be Gingervere. So Armina's madness as a whole is almost a little underutilized, I think. There are a few places where it could probably have been done a little better. But for the most part, Sarmina as Mad Queen is conveyed pretty well and is a very compelling element of the story. Um, Camp Willow is a good environment. The otters in general are really well portrayed. The squirrels not so much. I feel like the squirrels could have had a bit more to them. But the otters are really well done. Skipper of Otters, and Mask, his brother, they feel like brothers. And I'm saying that as someone who has a bunch of brothers. It's like they feel like brothers. They feel very natural together. Um, it feels well written. And Mask's heroism and death feels both dramatically appropriate and serves to give Skipper a good moment of revenge and heroism. It's a death done well. It provides a bittersweet moment to a daring escape, to a daring part um of the story. And actually, it's something that there are like two or three different escapes throughout the book, and all of them are done really well. Knopf and Martin's, Gingivier with Ferdy and Cogs. Ferdy and Cogs are great. Ferdy and Cogs are like one of the highlights of the story for me. Um, I do feel it's like they're almost a little unrealistically stoic and not stoic, but mature, but it works well enough. Um, it works. And Gingivier is great, though he's trusted rather quickly. Um, I feel like Gingivier's departure could have been handled better. And same with Bella's reuniting with him. Like if there was an actual, like if Sarmina had shown her forces capable of getting as far as Brock Hall, aside from Fortunata, who's a fox and kind of a specialist at infiltration, sort of, till she met Mask. Mask is very patchcoat. Mask is great. Again, um, I forget what the pike was called, but the pike was really good. Um, Speaking of pike, Gloomer. Gloomer, the sort of blind, angry water rat, felt almost a little underused. Like it's kind of Gloomer feels like Shadow. Shadow in Redwall was underused, like introduces this very dangerous special forces character, but then doesn't do much. Then Gloomer introduced as this um, highly dangerous, nigh uncontrollable water rat, and then is sort of killed to death by a pike. The fight is epic enough that it works. It's a beautifully written fight, but it could have been better, I think. If Gloomer had managed to take down or seriously wound one of the otters as opposed to just sort of being preemptively detected, maybe could have been better. But it feels like the threat was kind of underwhelming. Um, though it does set up very nicely why the rats don't try and invade Camp Willow later. They recognize that or why the weasels and stoats didn't try and attack Camp Willow later. They remember the pike in the water and they're scared of it. Um, Let me think. Martin is inducted onto the War Council, much like Matthias is, but I think with Martin it makes a lot more sense. Matthias is a novice. Martin is a warrior. Martin is experienced. He's seen the inside of the castle. He knows a good bit about the guards just from overhearing them. It's like it makes sense for him to be there. Um, Got a note here. I feel bad for Sarmina's subordinates. Yeah, that applies throughout. Clud gets killed by Skipper in a fantastic battle. I think my favorite battle in the whole book is Clud versus Skipper. And Clud gets replaced with Brog. Um, what are their names? Had a couple. Scratch, Blacktooth, and Spitnose. The pursuing Martinoff and Dinny as they go out for Salamandastron or Salamandastron, however you want to say it. That feels natural, and they're defeat feels natural, but their presence adds a vital element of tension to that portion of the book that would otherwise be very boring. Of them just sort of going across the land, them trying to avoid the ferret, weasel, and stoat chasing them adds that little bit of tension that's very helpful. Denny, by the way, the mole, this is something I noticed just throughout, is that character introductions feel very natural. Like they all have a place where it doesn't feel off that they just suddenly appear. Um, Also, having Denny and Old Denny is both amusing and it makes sense, and it works especially because they're separated. Um, I get the sense that Jake's liked the name Denny, so he had to. Um, but it makes sense to have a character named after his grandfather. It makes sense to have. It's like that's one of the ways you can, help build out a family tree easily is using cheats like that. Say someone has a strange name. Well, they were named after their grandfather, who was named after their great grandfather. However you want to do it. Um, One critique I have is that it does feel like there's a few too many locations, and I think in particular Moldeep could have been cut because Constance has this whole thing about this whole little side quest about needing to find somewhere else for everyone to camp, for the quorum to retreat to, possibly, should things get bad. And Gingy Revere's farm ends up being the place for that. But why not Moldeep? Most of the Woodlanders have already been there. Moldeep is an impenetrable fortress, more or less. Moles can always just burrow out in a different direction. It feels a bit odd. I think the Coram and like Martin and Friends plotlines are pretty well balanced. Just realized this whole vlog is going to be a lot more scatterbrained because I didn't organize my notes as nicely. Oh well. I feel the two plotlines are really balanced. The Coram one, it feels like it doesn't go too fast, but it goes at a good pace. There's a sort of rise and fall as the Coram and Katir have skirmishes with each other. And then with Martin and Co., there's this very natural feeling progression as they try and find quicker ways to get to the mountain, and they get themselves stuck in various places, and they figure out ways out. The bats I don't think show up anywhere else, but they're brilliant. I really love the bats. I think if I were to write, I think I could create an interesting monster or set of NPCs out of bats for my own, for like D&D or something. Um, but it's like, even setting that aside, they're interesting and they're fun and they're portrayed well. Um, let me see where. Let me see. Log-a-log. Yes, Log-a-log. Go to Log-a-log. Um, Once again, it's a bit odd that the shrews, there are so many shrews named Log-a-log, but that's just sort of that's something that becomes a trope later in the series, and so I don't mind it. Um, at this point, it feels like a reference to the first book more than anything else. And maybe a indication that this is the ancestor of the Log-a-log we meet in first book. Oh, that's right. I remembered. One of the things I remembered from my first read through was the like lizard and the snake. Um, uh, Forget what they're called. They weren't all that important, but it was the one that was pretending to be an adder that Log-a-log smacks, and that was really cool. Um, Frogs are an interesting encounter. Knopf's introduction is interesting. Or Knopf's reintroduction is interesting. It does feel like Martin and Dinny and Log didn't get all that much time to mourn him. Um, which is interesting because contrasting that with Mask is mourned actually really, really well. Um, and I like that. Martin, yeah, not enough, not mourned as much as he probably should have been at that point. But then he appears and it's all fine. It would probably have been awkward had they mourned him too much. Um, Snakefish's fun little encounter. The frogs, poor frogs. Um, but good riddance to them, I suppose. Um, so, mentioned that I really liked the Clud and Skipper fight. I want to explicate why very quickly. You might remember that I had a criticism of first book where Jake seemed to overuse exclamation points, particularly as sort of single, sort of separated sentences at the end of paragraphs that didn't give much. They just sort of restated or made explicit something that was already pretty clearly implicit. He's dropped that habit. He hasn't dropped the exclamation points entirely, but he's dropped the habit of using them frivolously and to no effect. Now, when he uses them, it feels like a treat. It feels like something useful and important. My favorite example of that, otter javelins are pointed on both ends. And that's how Clud dies, is he is knocked onto an otter javelin, and that spears him through. And that's a little moment, but it's important. And that exclamation point provides the emphasis that really makes it shine. So that's again, my notes are terribly organized. They're not organized. Stream of consciousness. Um, yeah, Ashley being the only officer, and then he deserts, which means Argalor doesn't eat him, and Ashley disappears from the story and doesn't reappear, and that's okay. And I think it works out. Um, Woodlanders are weirdly good at psychological warfare, both with the water and with all the weird stuff they did with Ferdy and Cogs and Spike and Posey and pretending that the young hogs were already out. Um, let's see what else. Gingerveer, I think, could have stayed with the Woodlanders a little longer before leaving. I think him leaving is a good idea, especially because it works out at the very end. But um, the Woodlanders go with undermining Katir, which is an interesting and actually really clever tactic. And I think the best part of it is that the plan doesn't actually go like perfectly well. It has hiccups, and that feels natural. Um, Something I noted on the beach. You know how I remember you? I said the first sentence made me feel like I was stepping into a painting. A couple chapters when they're on the beach with the crab and all the dunes and the tide pools. I had that same feeling again there. It was definitely Redwall, but it felt so different. It felt like a different place. But it felt different in a way that felt natural. It felt like an almost alien world within Redwall, and I appreciate that. That there's that variation. Dinny's fascination with shells is really cute. Dinny as a whole is just a great character. He's stalwart, he's fierce when he needs to be, but he's a kind soul at heart, and it shows. He's not a great fighter, though he's willing to put on the garb of one to assist his friends. Um, Jake's has a few characters like that, but Dinny is, I think, really the first one, and in my opinion, at least as far as I've read, one of the better ones. Brog is the one. Brog is the ferret or stoat that gets. Might be a weasel. I get the three mixed up. that takes over Clud's position. He has a tough job, is what I've noted here. Um, he really does. He gets Titanic, Leonardo DiCaprio. Um, there's room for two of us on that. There's room for two of them on that table, Sarmina. Oh, you poor Brog. Um, but then Tim Ballisto hits him. Tim Ballisto's feels like he comes in a little late. Little bit of a Deus Ex with the ballista, but it works. It works as a sort of a nice. There's a lot of things where it feels like this could have been executed a little better. This is a cool idea that could have made it been its own story, etc., etc. And it's like it feels like for most of the book, Jake's had a good idea of what he was doing, but there's a few parts where he doesn't quite, and you know what can you do? Books written. uh, I never made that video with what I do differently with Redwall, but the edits I would make there are significantly more than the ones I would make here. The only issues I have with Mossflower are quibbles. With Redwall, I had some actual structural arguments that I think could still make their own little video that I might make at some point. Might do it as part of the big retrospective at the end. I don't know. But Mossflower, all I've really got are minor issues. Trubswather and Fring, first real instance we get of the Long Patrol. Though I don't think the phrase I think Long Patrol as a phrase I think only appears in first appears in Mattimeo, with Basil explaining that he's been on a long patrol. But the fighting hairs of Salamandastron first appear here, and it's nice. It's well done. Salamandastron as a whole feels like a very mystical place. You've got this small order. It feels almost more holy than Redwall Abbey itself. You've got these ancient prophecies, the Badger Lords and their loyal hair servants, always finding their way to the mountain by fate. It gives you a lot of questions about what is the actual controlling forces of the world. And Jake's never really explores that. And I think that's in some ways a very good move. In some ways a move that confuses a lot of people. So it's interesting to see just how heavy that is in Mossflower. It's probably one of the books where that's emphasized more. Because the identity of the series hadn't quite solidified. I don't think the Badger prophecies are even mentioned in a lot of later books. Let me see. Eulalia doesn't actually appear in Mossflower. That first shows up in Mattimeo, with that being Orlando the Axe's battle cry, which is amusing because I believe the war cry Eulalia appears in Lord Brocktree, which is a prequel to Mossflower. So, interesting little detail there. The battle. One of the things that struck me about Salamandastron is the whole adventure there, and really Bor's tenure there and his rivalry with the Sea Rats. That could have been its own book, and I think the battle with the Sea Rats could have had a little more body to it, especially because it gives me a lot of questions. What happens to, how do the after Bor falls in combat, how do the remaining two hairs defend the mountain against the remaining horde of sea rats, especially with half a dozen hairs going off on wood chip. Yeah, that feels odd. Argalor's death, decent. Poor thing never got its Pine Martin. Haven't talked at all about Chib, I just realized. Fun character, good Robin. Makes me want to eat candy chestnuts now, though looking up candy chestnuts, they don't seem all that tasty. I don't like chestnut as a nut, personally. It's one of those ones that's never appealed to me. Much more to hazelnuts. Um, Katir's falling morale is really well done and well played, such that the near total surrender of the remaining garrison makes sense at the end. It feels natural. Um, the Blood Wake, it's like there's it's not quite clear that the hair's good on the Blood Wake initially. It's clear by like a couple within a couple of chapters, but um, it's like it's not as explicit as it should be. But the crew compliment on Blood Wake, where the galley crew gets turned into the into Martin's war party, that feels fun. Feels just like a really good, well done um, series of events. Especially since that crew eventually, like, that's the remaining Shrew tribe. Um, and Logalog basically, like, he takes over as captain, and he gathers the whole Shrew tribe into a war band, and then they go, march on Katir. Um, which is just it's again that sort of not quite an Adventures Assemble moment, but that like more Battle of Five Armies almost, where you have all the different forces coming together to battle at a single location. It feels feels fun. It's a nice trope, and I'm glad that Jakes uses it. Though, as like Mattimeo will show, it doesn't always need to occur. Let me see what else. Getting towards the end of my notes. Oh, that's right. So, chapter 3 is like 2 or 3 chapters. It's not very long at all. Um, and that's something I noticed with. So, really, this didn't need to be divided into 3 parts, I don't think. Um, especially because the last one's like it's like 3 chapters plus the epilogue chapters. It feels not even like a part. It's like, yes, the crew's assembled. Now let's fight Katir. Um, Sarmina seems to regain sanity by killing subordinates, or like getting rid of them. Like she'll kill someone and then she'll like be rather lucid, evil lucid, definitely, and still with that mad undertone, but um, she'll be a little more lucid for a couple more chapters before the nightmares of Gingerbeer return. Um, Weird little plot hole. How did Martin's armor end up on Bloodwake with Timbalisto? Like, felt weird. Like, if it was stolen, why wouldn't one of the like rats have worn it? Um, it's just odd little thing. It's I think a relic of like he's supposed to be an armor on the tapestry, and it feels odd to me. It could have been better. Again, a lot of these things could have been better if they had had a little more thought put into them. Sarmina, even at her most mad, doesn't lack a sense of self preservation, which is I think something very good and very refreshing. Um, Timbalista's arrival with the siege engine feels like a nice final nail in the coffin for Katir, even if it feels a little contrived. Um, Martin's battle against Sarmina is really good. Not as good, I think, as the battle between Clud and Skipper, but a really good battle that sells how dangerous Sarmina is. Um, I've got noted here grievous injury, palpable fear. And that feels appropriate, I think. Um, Mossflower's actually got the battle ends really nicely, and after and we get a little bit of exposition as Martin sort of wakes up, and then we get two epilogue chapters, um, basically going over the little bit of the Abbey's history, and then finishing off the frame narrative starting in the first chapter, or starting the prologue, basically, um, which isn't numbered. Um, there are a couple of again, this one mostly quibbles rather than like real criticisms. Um, so I, I enjoyed this way more than I expected to. Enjoying Mattimeo a lot, so expect a glowing review of that in the near future. I've got about a page or so of notes already. Maybe I'll organize them, maybe I won't. We'll see. Find out on the next exciting episode of Iris talks about Redwall for 45 minutes or so. I have no clue how long this recording has gone on because I'm using a different recording software than I used to, and so I can't actually see that count usually. I'll figure out something. Maybe I'll use a stopwatch next time. Who knows? Anyway, Mattimeo next week. Mossflower is good. You should read it. I'd read Redwall first before I read Mossflower. Um, it's like Redwall's rough, but I'd still read it. Mossflower a lot less rough, though with edges that can be polished. Jake's is definitely on the path, and I can't wait to see what he does next.